The self-destruct sequence had already begun. Deep beneath the Arctic Ocean, at a depth of 187 feet, 6 Navy combat divers in closed-circuit rebreathers were working in near-total darkness against the hull of a 79-foot autonomous weapon. A Russian Status-6 Poseidon, nuclear-powered, nuclear-armed, adrift, unresponsive to its controllers. And somewhere inside that hull, a pressure-sensitive fail-safe mechanism was counting down toward detonation. The divers had approximately 40 minutes to locate the arming circuit access panel, remove it, and disable the mechanism before it triggered. They were working blind, in water hovering at 28 degrees Fahrenheit, below the freezing point of fresh water, kept liquid only by the salinity of the Barents Sea. 14 minutes of their window had already been lost to a jammed equipment hatch before the first diver hit the water. This is Operation Frozen Harvest, classified at the highest levels of American intelligence for nearly 2 years. Partially declassified in June 2026, following a Congressional Intelligence Subcommittee review, and one of the most consequential covert recovery operations in the history of the United States Navy. 3 questions are going to drive this story. How does a 79-foot nuclear drone drift 142 nautical miles from its test point without the Russians recovering it first? How does an American submarine find it in one of the most hostile ocean environments on Earth? And how do you recover a 40-metric-ton nuclear weapon in secret, in waters Moscow considers its own, without starting a war? Those answers are all coming. But to understand them fully, you first need to understand what the Poseidon actually is, and why the United States Navy was willing to risk everything to get hold of one. In March 2018, Russian President Vladimir Putin stood before the Russian Federal Assembly in Moscow and unveiled what he described as a new generation of strategic weapon systems that had rendered Western missile defense capabilities obsolete. The presentation included video animations, technical briefing slides, and Putin's own characterizations of what each system could do. Most Western analysts watching that address focused on the hypersonic missiles and the nuclear-powered cruise missile. A smaller number focused on what Putin described as a nuclear-powered, nuclear-armed autonomous underwater vehicle, the Poseidon. The Status-6 designation that Western intelligence uses for this weapon comes from a document that reportedly leaked in 2015 during a Russian state television broadcast, a briefing slide briefly visible in background footage that showed technical specifications for what was then described as a classified project. Western analysts assessed at the time that the visible leak might have been deliberate. Moscow never confirmed that assessment. What they confirmed, 3 years later in Putin's 2018 address, was that the weapon was real. The strategic concept behind the Poseidon is unlike any other nuclear delivery system in any arsenal on Earth. A conventional ballistic missile is fast, predictable in its flight path, and detectable by early warning systems within minutes of launch. A cruise missile is slow but low-flying and difficult to track. The Poseidon is none of these things. It is a submarine-launched autonomous underwater vehicle, nuclear-powered, with a theoretical range exceeding 10,000 kilometers. It travels deep, far beneath the operational depth of surface ships and at the edge of what most naval torpedo defenses can engage. It is slow relative to a missile, but it does not need to be fast, because it is essentially undetectable during transit by existing ASW technologies if it is operating correctly. And it carries a warhead estimated at between 2 and 100 megatons, depending on which configuration is loaded, a range of uncertainty that itself reflects how little Western intelligence knew about the weapon's actual specifications before June 2026. The delivery concept is not about destroying military targets. Russian strategic documents discussing what Western analysts call the Poseidon concept, some of which have been partially declassified over the years, some of which are inferred from open-source Russian strategic writing, describe the weapon's purpose in terms that cut through the typical euphemisms of nuclear strategy. The idea is not mutual assured destruction in the classic sense. The idea is area denial. A 100-megaton detonation offshore from a major coastal city does not just level the city. It generates a seismic event and a thermal pulse of extraordinary scale. It creates a radioactive tsunami, a mass of seawater absorbing and dispersing the weapon's radiological output that inundates hundreds of miles of coastline with contamination that cannot be remediated in any human timescale. The Russian phrase for this effect, documented in an early technical specification that Western analysts recovered and analyzed, translates roughly as guaranteed uninhabitable zone. Not just a city destroyed, a coastline ended. If the Poseidon carries a cobalt-jacketed warhead, which post-recovery analysis confirmed it does, the effect is amplified across generations. Cobalt-60 has a half-life of 5.27 years. Dispersed across a coastal environment, it persists in soil, in marine sediment, in the water table. The affected area does not recover in a decade. It does not recover in a lifetime. The weapon is designed not to defeat an adversary militarily, but to remove entire sections of its geography from the category of places where human civilization can function. That is what was lying on the seafloor of the Barents Sea in late 2024, drifting away from its test coordinates, 142 nautical miles from where the Russians had planned to recover it. And that is what the USS Indiana was about to be asked to bring home. The USS Indiana, hull number SSN-789, is a Virginia-class Block IV attack submarine. She was commissioned on September 29, 2018, at a ceremony in Groton, Connecticut, where General Dynamics Electric Boat has built American submarines since the early 20th century. She is 377 feet long, displaces 7,900 tons when submerged, and carries a crew of 135 officers and enlisted personnel. Her construction cost was approximately $3.4 billion. A figure that reflects not just the steel and electronics that make up her hull, but the accumulated generations of engineering knowledge embedded in every system she carries. Virginia-class submarines are the United States Navy's primary attack submarine platform, designed as multi-mission vessels capable of intelligence gathering, special operations support, anti-submarine warfare, anti-surface warfare, and strike missions from the same hull. The Block IV variant introduced the Virginia payload module in later boats, but the Indiana's most operationally significant feature for what would become Frozen Harvest was her dry deck shelter, a pressurized module mounted to her hull forward of the sail, designed to embark, transport, and deploy special operations forces and their equipment while the submarine remains submerged. Dry deck shelters allow SEAL teams to lock out of a submarine at operational depth, conduct missions, and return, without the submarine ever needing to surface. They are the mechanical interface between the submarine force and the special warfare community, and the Indiana's was current generation, high capability, and rated for Arctic operations. By late 2024, the Indiana was operating in the Barents Sea under orders that are described in released documents only as intelligence collection. That language covers a wide range of activity. American submarines maintain a persistent presence in Arctic and subarctic waters, monitoring Russian naval operations, characterizing the acoustic signatures of Russian vessels and systems for reference libraries, observing exercise patterns, and logging the behavior of Russian nuclear systems from the safe distance of passive sonar range. It is continuous, dangerous, technically demanding work that has been conducted without significant public acknowledgement since the early Cold War. The submarines conducting it are rarely named publicly. Their specific locations and tasks are never discussed. They are simply there, and they have been there, without interruption, for longer than most of their crew members have been alive. On the night the Poseidon's navigation system failed during its test transit, the Indiana's sonar team picked up a contact. The contact was anomalous in ways that a trained sonar operator would notice immediately and an untrained observer would not. It was moving at variable speeds in a pattern inconsistent with normal propulsion. It was changing depth unpredictably. Its acoustic signature did not match any entry in the Indiana's extensive reference library of Russian naval systems. Not a surface vessel, not a submarine, not a known autonomous system. It was emitting a faint, low-frequency signal in a frequency range that an experienced sonar petty officer noted in his watch log as characteristic of a nuclear power system's secondary cooling circuit vibration signature. Not loud enough for certainty, distinctive enough for attention. The Indiana's commanding officer, whose identity remains classified in all released documents, was briefed by his sonar supervisor. He made the decision that would define the next 23 days. They would follow. For 72 hours, the Indiana tracked the failing Poseidon across 142 nautical miles of Arctic sea floor as the drone's power systems gradually deteriorated. The submarine ran in what the Navy calls a quiet configuration, a state that goes beyond simply turning off active sonar. In quiet configuration, non-essential machinery is secured. Ventilation fans are switched to low-speed modes. The galley reduces operations. Crew members in work areas near the hull move carefully. Every system that generates a mechanical vibration, every rotation of a pump or fan, contributes to the submarine's acoustic signature, and acoustic signature is the margin between survival and detection in these waters. The Indiana was already quiet. In the Barents Sea, tracking a contact whose loss would mean the loss of whatever opportunity this represented, she became quieter. Communications were reduced to pre-scheduled burst transmissions, encrypted, compressed, and broadcast in packages of less than 2 milliseconds each. A 2-millisecond burst is essentially undetectable to passive listeners. It requires active, focused SIGINT collection aimed at the right frequency at exactly the right moment to intercept. The Indiana was not talking. She was listening, and occasionally whispering. What she was listening to was the sound of something extraordinary dying. The Poseidon's power systems failed progressively over the 72 hours of transit. The low-frequency signature grew fainter, then intermittent, then stopped. The drone had settled on the seafloor in approximately 187 feet of water, roughly 31 nautical miles north of where the Russians had planned to begin their recovery phase. The acoustic track ended. The contact went cold. The Indiana held position above the contact's last known location and transmitted a situation report. That report, partially described in the June 2026 declassification, moved through the chain of command with a speed that the record describes as urgent. The implications were obvious to anyone with the relevant knowledge. A Russian strategic nuclear weapon was lying unguarded on the floor of the Barents Sea. The Russians knew it was missing and had begun searching. The United States Navy had an attack submarine on location, fitted with a dry deck shelter and capable of embarking a special operations team. And the window during which the weapon would be accessible before Russian search efforts either located it or before its self-destruct system interpreted its situation as an unauthorized recovery attempt. That window was finite and potentially very short. The decision to proceed with a recovery operation was made, according to the declassified record, within 18 hours of the situation report's transmission. The approval chain included NAVSEA, the Joint Chiefs, and the National Security Council. No prior congressional notification was provided. The record notes this without elaboration. Its implications are something we will return to. Naval Special Warfare Command was alerted. SDV Team 2, the SEAL unit trained specifically for underwater vehicle operations in denied environments, was ordered to forward deploy to a staging facility from which they could be transferred to the Indiana. Recovery planning began simultaneously at NAVSEA and ONI, working from existing intelligence estimates of the Poseidon's external hull configuration. Equipment was positioned, and the Indiana was given a revised mission order: maintain position, maintain acoustic silence, and await the SEAL team. I spent weeks going through the available declassified record on this operation, and one detail in the mission planning documentation kept pulling my attention back. The analyst confidence level in the initial situation report, the confidence that what the Indiana was tracking was actually a Poseidon, is described as high, not certain, high. They committed to a multinational intelligence recovery operation, to the risk of triggering a confrontation with a nuclear power, and to the lives of a SEAL team on a high confidence assessment. Not a certainty, a well-supported estimate. That is how decisions actually get made at this level of consequence. You never wait for certainty, because certainty never comes. You act on the best assessment available, and you accept the weight of the risk. The SEAL team transferred to the Indiana by a method the declassified record does not describe. Total elapsed time from the initial situation report to the moment the SEALs were briefed and aboard was approximately 96 hours. During those 96 hours, the Indiana held her position in silence above a nuclear weapon on the seafloor, waiting. What no one in the planning phase had fully accounted for was the Poseidon's self-destruct protocol. Post-recovery analysis confirmed what the SEAL team discovered in real time. The weapon's fail-safe system was not a timer-based countdown mechanism in the conventional sense. It was a pressure-sensitive arming circuit tied to the drone's power management system. As the Poseidon's reactor control systems degraded after the navigation failure, an onboard safety protocol began interpreting the progressive power loss as an indication of unauthorized external access. The protocol was designed to prevent recovery by a foreign intelligence service, specifically to prevent the scenario that was now unfolding. As the power degradation crossed a threshold in the system's logic, the arming circuit activated and began a countdown sequence toward self-destruct. The countdown, when the SEAL team's planning intelligence estimated it, gave them approximately 40 minutes from submersion to complete the disable procedure. They planned for 90 minutes of total time underwater. The disable was the first task. Everything else came after. The team prepared over 18 hours. Equipment verification. Atmospheric assessment for the water column above the contact. Mission rehearsal using the mock-up components available aboard the Indiana. Backup procedures. Contingencies. The team leader reviewed the intelligence packet on the Poseidon's external hull configuration that had been prepared based on years of accumulated intelligence, satellite imagery, sonar profiles, fragments of technical documentation recovered through various means over the preceding decade. That packet placed the arming circuit access panel at a position approximately 31 feet from the drone's nose tip on the port side of the hull. The first problem arrived before a single diver hit the water. During the final preparations to open the dry deck shelter's lockout hatch, the hatch refused to cycle. An O-ring seal in the primary locking mechanism had been compromised by the sustained cold. Water temperature outside the hull was 28 degrees Fahrenheit, below the temperature specification for the O-ring compound used in the hatch assembly. The shelter was pressurized. The hatch would not open, and no amount of normal operating procedure was going to change that. The Indiana's chief of the boat and a SEAL warrant officer worked the problem inside the pressurized chamber, with the submarine's engineering officer providing guidance by intercom. The technical manual contained a manual override procedure using secondary locking pins, a procedure designed exactly for this failure mode, but never executed in a deployed field environment. Working in the confined, dimly lit interior of the shelter, with both men aware that every minute spent on this fix was a minute subtracted from a 40-minute operational window, they completed the bypass in 22 minutes. The divers entered the water with 18 minutes remaining on their estimated self-destruct window. What happened in those 18 minutes is described in the declassified record with the most compressed and restrained language of any section of the document, which is its own kind of indication that the reality of what occurred is not fully captured by the words used to describe it. The team reached the Poseidon's hull in 4 minutes. The drone was lying at a 7-degree list, nose section partially embedded in soft Arctic sediment, tail section clear of the bottom. Team 2 went to the tail and began attaching preliminary tow rigging points as planned. Team 1 moved to the nose section and began searching, by touch, by feel, in zero visibility water that the closed circuit rebreathers did not illuminate, for the access panel at the position the intelligence packet specified. It was not there. The SEAL team leader swept the hull manually for 3 minutes before his gloved hands found the actual panel location, approximately 4 feet aft of the position indicated in the mock-up. The intelligence estimate had placed it incorrectly. The mock-up, built on estimates that underestimated the actual weapon's length by nearly 8 feet, had trained the team for a position that did not match the real vehicle. The team leader had 11 minutes left on the estimated window. He removed 4 titanium fasteners with a specialized driver tool. He located the arming circuit board by feel. He executed the disable procedure that he had rehearsed on a mock-up where the same board was in a physically different position. His hands remembered what his eyes could not confirm. The clock in his head ran to 0, then past 0. 4 more minutes. No detonation. The arming circuit was dead. The Poseidon was secure. Put yourself in that team leader's position for a moment. Working blind. In water that is trying to shut down your fine motor control. A timer running past 0 in your head. A 40 metric ton nuclear weapon underneath your hands. And the access panel was in the wrong place, and you had to find it, and you had to get it open, and you had to disable it, and you did. The entire disable procedure, from locating the actual panel to confirmed circuit disconnect, took 11 minutes and 43 seconds. Securing the self-destruct circuit bought time. It did not solve the fundamental problem of what to do with a 79-foot, 40 metric ton autonomous nuclear vehicle that the United States government needed to move in absolute secrecy across hundreds of miles of ocean controlled by the nation that built it. The recovery vehicle that NAVSEA had planned to forward deploy for exactly this contingency was not available. It had sustained mechanical damage during a prior exercise and was undergoing repair at General Dynamics facility in Groton. The alternative was improvisation at the highest level of naval engineering, using what was aboard the Indiana. Over the 36 hours that followed the initial dive, the Indiana's engineering officer and a NAVSEA technical consultant who had been brought aboard before the operation commenced worked with the SEAL team to construct a tow harness from components normally used in the submarine's under-ice sensor maintenance operations. The resulting configuration was not elegant. It was not designed to specification. It was built from high-tension cable, repurposed mounting hardware, and structural brackets adapted from secondary equipment on the submarine that the engineering officer judged non-essential to her primary mission systems. The harness design had to meet one fundamental requirement above all others. It had to keep the Poseidon suspended beneath the Indiana's hull at operating depth without raising the weapon to a pressure differential that might trigger backup fail-safe systems. The engineering team calculated the margin. It was thin. Transit speed would need to be kept between 4 and 6 knots to avoid cavitation on the tow cable at depth, a fraction of the Indiana's normal cruising speed. At 4 to 6 knots, the distance to the classified Norwegian facility designated as the recovery point represented approximately 19 days of transit. 19 days. 135 crew members, 6 SEAL team operators, 1 40 metric ton nuclear weapon tethered beneath the submarine's hull on improvised rigging, in waters where Russian anti-submarine warfare aircraft were already beginning to intensify their search operations for the missing test drone. The mission clock started. The most surprising thing about what followed is not that the crew maintained acoustic discipline for 19 days. It is what acoustic discipline actually demands in practice. It is not a passive state. It is an active, continuous, exhausting performance of self-regulation that extends to every member of the crew, on every watch, for every hour of the transit. No active sonar. The submarine is navigating and operating without the acoustic equivalent of headlights. Cooking is minimized because convection currents from galley heat sources create acoustic signatures. Crew members wear soft-soled footwear throughout the boat. Non-essential machinery is secured. Internal communications are conducted at voice levels that would be considered whispers in any other environment. Anything dropped on a metal deck is a potential intelligence signature. Any pump that vibrates outside its normal tolerance is a risk. The submarine becomes a vessel of enforced, conscious quiet, maintained by 135 people simultaneously for 19 days, in the knowledge that any deviation from these standards could end the mission, and could end it in ways that went beyond the operational. 3 times during the transit, Russian ASW aircraft dropped sonobuoy patterns in the Indiana's vicinity. A sonobuoy is a passive acoustic listening device, expendable, dropped from maritime patrol aircraft to detect submerged submarine noise. When an aircraft drops a pattern of them, a geometric grid of listening posts in the water column, it is searching. The appropriate response for a submarine caught inside such a pattern is to go deeper, reduce speed to minimum, and wait for the pattern to expire or the aircraft to depart. The Indiana did this 3 times. Each wait lasted between 4 and 11 hours. The second sonobuoy encounter, on day 9 of the transit, was the one that generated the most concern. The Indiana's sonar team assessed the pattern geometry as a focused search response, not a random patrol. A random patrol drops sonobuoys in a wide, sparse pattern. This was denser, more directed. Someone was looking for something in the Indiana's approximate operating area. Whether the search was triggered by a Russian acoustic detection of the Indiana herself, by a logical search box centered on the Poseidon's last known position, or by some other intelligence that the declassified record does not describe, the document does not say. What it says is that the Indiana went to maximum safe depth for the tow configuration, reduced speed to 2 knots, and waited for 11 hours. The Russian aircraft departed. No contact was localized. The Indiana resumed transit. Here is what this tells us about the operational reality of the modern strategic competition in the Arctic. The Barents Sea is, for practical ASW purposes, Russian territory. Russia's Northern Fleet maintains a layered ASW capability in these waters: fixed bottom arrays, maritime patrol aircraft, surface ASW vessels, and submarine forces that NATO's own assessment documents acknowledge as among the most capable in the world outside of American home waters. The Indiana transited through this environment for 19 days, trailing a foreign nuclear weapon on improvised rigging at reduced speed without detection. That is not an accident. It is the result of an operational culture deliberately built over decades of continuous Arctic operations, maintained at significant cost and risk, because the United States Navy understood before the Cold War ended that this kind of mission would eventually be necessary. Most people assume that modern sensor technology has made the kind of submarine espionage that defined Cold War competition significantly more difficult, that improved acoustics, satellite surveillance, and space-based sensors have closed the windows through which American submarines previously operated. The evidence from Frozen Harvest argues otherwise. The operational capability demonstrated by the Indiana in those 19 days suggests that the window has not closed. It has evolved, and American submarines continue to operate inside it. The second major obstacle arrived on day 14 of the transit. The tow harness had been constructed under field conditions, from materials not engineered for the sustained mechanical stress of a prolonged tow at depth. At day 14, vibration sensors attached to the rigging during daily engineering inspections detected stress fractures developing in a custom fabricated clamp assembly on the Poseidon's forward hull section, one of 4 primary attachment points in the tow configuration. The engineering officer's assessment was precise. At current transit speed and load, the clamp would fail within 72 hours, possibly sooner. The failure scenario was not survivable for the mission. If the Poseidon separated from the tow harness at depth and impacted the seafloor at transit speed, the weapon's physical integrity could not be guaranteed. An impact-damaged Poseidon was worth nothing to the Office of Naval Intelligence. A Poseidon that impacted hard enough to compromise its warhead section. The probability of detonation was assessed as low, but low is not zero on a weapon of this category, was a catastrophe of a different order entirely. The Indiana surfaced, briefly, at night, in an ice marginal zone chosen because satellite coverage was assessed as minimal based on known orbital timing for Russian reconnaissance systems. The surface exposure lasted 4 hours. During those 4 hours, 3 members of the engineering crew worked on the submarine's hull in sub-freezing temperatures, in darkness, wearing safety harnesses clipped to deck fittings against the risk of Arctic swells. They reinforced the compromised clamp mounting with materials fabricated from structural hardware aboard the submarine, adding redundant attachment through cable run from secondary load points that had not been part of the original improvised design. The repair work was guided by the engineering officer through a waterproof radio handset from the bridge and verified manually by each worker before the team returned below. The Indiana's commanding officer was on the bridge during the repair. The declassified record notes this with a specificity unusual for a government document. The briefing note describes him as coordinating with the repair team and assessing surface conditions. There is an additional sentence, one that reportedly was flagged for redaction review but survived the process, which describes him as expressing confidence in the crew's readiness and accepting any outcome. In government prose, that is the language of a man who has made his peace with the possibility that the mission ends here, on the surface, in the dark, in the Barents Sea. The repair held. The Indiana returned to depth. The transit resumed. One detail from the record that stayed with us more than any other in the full account of Frozen Harvest. Of the 6 combat divers who made the initial recovery dive to the Poseidon, 3 were treated for hypothermia upon return to the Indiana. Not before the dive, after it. Each of the 3 had monitored the other team members throughout the operation and concluded, based on the others' sustained performance, that he was the only one struggling with the cold. All 3 assumed they were the outlier. All 3 kept working because they believed the others were fine and only they were not. There is a specific kind of courage in that detail that does not translate well into formal language. All 3 believed themselves to be the weakest person in the water. None of them stopped. The Indiana arrived at a classified Norwegian naval facility on the evening of Day 23 of Operation Frozen Harvest. The transfer of the Poseidon from the tow configuration to a secured handling environment was conducted under conditions the declassified record describes only as extraordinary security precautions. The physical infrastructure required to receive a 40 metric ton autonomous nuclear vehicle, specialized lift capability, a sealed environment appropriate for handling a nuclear power system, hazmat protocols, security cordons that would not generate observable signatures to overhead collection systems, had been prepared in advance. How those preparations were made without the preparation activity becoming visible to Russian intelligence assets monitoring Norwegian facilities is not addressed in any released document. What followed at that facility over the subsequent weeks and months represents the most significant technical exploitation of a Russian strategic nuclear system in American intelligence history. The Office of Naval Intelligence coordinated the analysis, working alongside nuclear engineers from Los Alamos National Laboratory, technical analysts from the Defense Intelligence Agency, and specialists from the Naval Research Laboratory. The June 2026 Congressional Review released enough of the assessment findings to understand their outline. The specific technical details remain classified. The 14-megawatt reactor architecture proved to be both more technically sophisticated and more operationally vulnerable than American analysts had estimated before the recovery. Both findings were significant, and they pointed in opposite directions. More sophisticated, the thermal output management system in the Poseidon's reactor achieved a level of miniaturization that exceeded Western intelligence assessments of Russian nuclear engineering capability. The power density achieved in this reactor, the ratio of output to physical volume, represented a genuine engineering advance. The United States Navy's own nuclear engineering community, reviewing the findings through the appropriate classification channels, concluded that the Russian team that designed this system had solved a power density problem that American naval nuclear engineers had assessed as unsolved at their most recent evaluation. That conclusion alone, independent of every other finding from Frozen Harvest, would have justified the entire operation from a pure intelligence standpoint. More vulnerable. The cooling system architecture relied on a single-loop design without redundancy. In standard naval nuclear engineering practice, redundant cooling systems are not optional. They are fundamental to both safety and operational reliability, and they are present in every Western naval nuclear plant as a basic design requirement. The Poseidon's single-loop architecture had sacrificed redundancy to achieve the miniaturization required for the weapon's physical dimensions. The consequence of that trade-off was a specific operational vulnerability, a targeted disruption of the cooling circuit through methods that the classified portion of the analysis specifies would produce a reactor shutdown from which the vehicle had no autonomous recovery capability. The intelligence reporting derived from that finding reportedly drove significant revisions to American strategic assessments of the Belgorod-class program. The Belgorod relies on the same fundamental cooling architecture as the Poseidon. The vulnerability identified in the recovered drone was not unique to that specific vehicle. It was systemic. The warhead casing analysis produced the finding that generated what the declassified record describes as the most significant strategic intelligence output of the entire operation. The casing was cobalt-jacketed. This confirmed what the leaked 2015 document had suggested and what many Western analysts had assessed as potentially disinformation. It was not disinformation. The Russians had built the cobalt jacket into the Poseidon's warhead configuration, and the implications of that confirmation changed American strategic modeling of the weapon's effects in ways that the declassified record is careful not to specify. What the public portion of the assessment says is this: a cobalt-jacketed nuclear warhead detonated at depth near a major coastal area creates contamination with a half-life of 5.27 years that disperses through seawater, marine sediment, and coastal soil in ways that cannot be remediated in any practical human timescale. The blast and thermal effects of a 100-megaton detonation are catastrophic across a radius measured in hundreds of miles. The cobalt contamination extends that effect into decades. The briefing document summarizing the warhead analysis used a phrase that reportedly required multiple rounds of classification review before the June 2026 disclosure was authorized to release it. The phrase was strategic area denial at the civilizational level. The Russians were not building a weapon to destroy a city. They were building a weapon to end the habitability of a coastline for a generation. The deterrence logic behind that distinction is different from anything in the established literature of nuclear strategy, and the June 2026 disclosure of this finding has driven the most significant academic and policy debate in strategic studies since the end of the Cold War. Here is the take that will generate pushback, and we are going to say it plainly. The partial declassification of Frozen Harvest in June 2026 was not a transparency measure. It was a calculated strategic signal. The congressional subcommittee members who authorized the partial release and the senior intelligence community officials who approved the specific technical details cleared for disclosure were not acting from a sense of historical obligation or democratic accountability. They were communicating to Moscow with the precision that only specific verifiable facts can achieve. We recovered your Poseidon. We analyzed it completely. We know the reactor cooling vulnerabilities in your Belgorod-class platform. We know the cobalt configuration. We know what the self-destruct sequence looks like from the outside. We know the access panel is 4 feet further aft than your mock-up would suggest. And we did all of this in your waters, in 2024, without you confirming it had happened until we chose to tell you. That is not historical record. That is deterrence communication. And it was delivered not through a diplomatic back channel or a treaty conference, but through a congressional intelligence review that the world's press corps could report on freely. What do you think? Does this kind of controlled disclosure make the world more or less stable? Is signaling Russia through declassification a form of strategic sophistication, or does it normalize a kind of recklessness that will eventually miscalculate? Comment below. We read everything, and this one genuinely divides the analysis community. The Poseidon's reactor was safely decommissioned at the Norwegian facility by a team of naval nuclear engineers operating under health physics protocols appropriate to the system's power level. The weapon's propulsion and navigation systems were disassembled and analyzed in detail. The warhead was handled under protocols that the declassified record declines to specify. Key components were retained for continued reverse engineering analysis and, in several cases, for assessment programs whose descriptions remain entirely classified. The remaining portions of the weapon were destroyed by methods not specified in released documentation. The Russians knew something had gone wrong. The Belgorod's recorded activity, inferred from observation over the period following the failed test, not from any document that describes Russian internal communications, shows no further operational Poseidon test launches for at least 14 months after the period in which frozen harvest took place. Russian state media eventually reported that the test referenced in Western reporting had concluded as planned. That statement is either a deliberate strategic lie or an indication that Russian military command itself was uncertain what had actually happened to the test drone, whether it had been lost to a malfunction, sunk, or recovered by a foreign intelligence service. Russia's FSB opened an investigation. The declassified record notes this in a single line, describing Russian counterintelligence activity as an intelligence indicator that Moscow was aware of an anomaly without having confirmed that a foreign recovery had occurred. The investigation reportedly continued for an extended period. Its conclusions are not referenced in any released document, which itself suggests they did not produce a definitive finding. What the 14-month pause in Poseidon testing communicates to defense analysts who have reviewed the available record is a straightforward message. Russia knew the weapon was missing. They did not know who had it, what had been learned from it, or whether continuing the program in its existing configuration would expose further vulnerabilities to whatever intelligence service had recovered the drone. They could not make that assessment without knowing the scope of what had been taken. So they paused. They assessed, and they redesigned. The Poseidon program has reportedly resumed with a variant that incorporates design modifications. The technical specifications of those modifications are not publicly available. Whether the redesign addresses the cooling architecture vulnerability identified through frozen harvest is not confirmed in any released document. The 14-month pause is consistent with a program-level architectural review, not just a response to a single test failure. That level of program response suggests the Belgorod's operators understood they were redesigning against a known intelligence penetration, not merely correcting a navigation malfunction. The congressional oversight dimension of Operation Frozen Harvest generated the most politically contentious portion of the June 2026 review. Several committee members objected strongly, not to the operation's objectives or execution, which the outcome had validated, but to the framework under which it had been conducted. The operation was approved at the executive level without prior notification to the full intelligence oversight committees. The justification offered was operational security. The standard congressional briefing process involves enough personnel and enough formal documentation that the probability of a damaging disclosure before the mission could complete was assessed as unacceptable. Several committee members found that justification unconvincing in its scope, if not in its specific application. An operation conducted in foreign waters involving the recovery of a nuclear weapon with the potential to trigger a direct military confrontation between nuclear-armed states. This is the category of action for which congressional oversight mechanisms were most specifically designed. The fact that those mechanisms were bypassed even in service of an operation that succeeded brilliantly, establishes a precedent whose implications extend beyond Frozen Harvest to every operation of equivalent sensitivity that preceded it and everyone that will follow. Looking at this case honestly, the real question it raises isn't whether the operation was worth conducting. The intelligence returns confirmed that it was, by any reasonable assessment. The real question is what it means that the framework for making decisions of this magnitude, decisions with the potential to change the trajectory of a nuclear confrontation, is operated by a group of people small enough to fit in a conference room without meaningful external oversight, by design. Frozen Harvest succeeded. The next operation of this category may not. And the absence of oversight applies equally to both outcomes. That is not a partisan observation. It is a structural one. And it is the observation that the June 2026 declassification was least designed to generate and most likely to produce in anyone who reads the full record carefully. The USS Indiana returned to her home port at the end of a deployment that, in official records and public statements, appears as a routine patrol of standard duration. Nothing in the Navy's public communications about the Indiana's activities during the relevant period is inconsistent with a normal mission profile. The families who met the crew on the pier when she returned did not know what had happened in the Arctic. The neighbors of those families did not know. The Navy's Public Affairs Office issued no statements about the deployment. 3 crew members received the Navy Cross, the United States Navy's second highest military decoration, awarded for extraordinary heroism in combat or in connection with military operations, in a private ceremony at the White House attended by fewer than 20 people. The citations describe extraordinary heroism and distinguished service in connection with military operations against an opposing armed force, in the specific neutral language of classified military awards that reveals nothing about what the award was actually for. The citations are classified. The photographs from the ceremony are classified. The names of the 3 recipients have not appeared in any document released through June 2026. 3 Navy crosses. No public names. No public acknowledgement in any forum where it could be reported. No mechanism by which the people who know what these men or women did can say so to anyone outside the cleared community. Team necessary secrecy or team they deserve public recognition, put your answer in the comments. We want to know where you stand, because this question does not have an obvious answer, and the people it's actually about cannot weigh in publicly. The USS Indiana is on active service. The Barents Sea has not gotten quieter. The Belgorod is still operating from the Northern Fleet's bases on the Kola Peninsula. The competition beneath the Arctic surface, the competition that has been running since the Cold War without a single acknowledged interruption, has not paused for a day. What has changed is what each side now knows about the other's capabilities and vulnerabilities. The Poseidon's cooling architecture is understood. Its warhead configuration is analyzed. Its self-destruct mechanism is documented in detail in a classified technical library that will inform American submarine and special operations planning for decades. And somewhere under the Arctic ice, right now, an American submarine is listening. She knows where to look. She knows what she's looking for. And she knows, because of what happened in 23 days of darkness and silence in 2024, exactly how to get to it. Operation Frozen Harvest demonstrated more concretely than any previous declassified case what American submarine capability actually means in the modern strategic environment. It means that the United States Navy can find, recover, and fully analyze Russia's most secret nuclear weapon system in Russian waters against active Russian search efforts in Arctic winter conditions, without Russia confirming that it happened until the United States chose to disclose it. That capability is not a historical artifact. It is active, it is ongoing, and it is being exercised right now in operations whose names you will not learn for another 2 years, or 5, or 20, if at all. If that kind of analysis is what brought you to Deep Blue Warfare, subscribe and hit the bell. Every week, We go inside the classified record of the naval operations that shape global power. And if you want to understand the full Belgorod mission profile, what it can carry, how it's deployed, and what the frozen harvest findings mean for the Poseidon program going forward, that breakdown is already live and linked above. The reactor findings alone will change how you think about Russian strategic deterrence. Stay silent out there.